In late 2004, the Second Battle of Fallujah commenced. It was an American-led offensive during the Iraq War, with the operation involving the efforts of the United States, United Kingdom, and Iraqi interim government, in what is considered the war's first major engagement against the Iraqi insurgency, as opposed to its military forces. The conflict resulted in as many as 2,000 insurgent deaths, and has been described as the single bloodiest battle of the entire war. This is the story of the Second Battle of Fallujah. Welcome to Wars of the World. The city of Fallujah is located just over 30 miles west of Baghdad, resting on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River. A densely populated industrial city, in 2004 it was a stronghold of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. And following the initial Battle of Fallujah in the spring of 2004, it became an extremist hub, attracting insurgents from nearby cities. Though a newly formed Iraqi security unit, named the Fallujah Brigade, had been charged with taking care of the city and preventing insurgents from returning, the brigade's presence was short-lived. Those who were part of the brigade were largely uninterested in conflict and confrontation, and the group ultimately disbanded, with some members choosing to join the insurgency instead. Thus, over the following months, Fallujah fell back into the hands of the extremists. Rough estimates place around 4,500 insurgents in Fallujah by late 2004. And though the Iraqi interim government attempted to extinguish the insurgents themselves, they failed to do so. Extremists continued to walk the streets, blending in with the crowds, and easily able to stay hidden in such a sprawling and densely packed cityscape. This caused concern to both Iraqi and American officials, as the first general election was coming up in January 2005. And both governments worried that the insurgents would undermine the process and that the citizens would be prevented from casting their vote. These concerns ultimately incentivized US, UK, and Iraqi political and military figures to retake the city of Fallujah. The planned attack on insurgents within the city was originally codenamed Operation Phantom Fury, but the Iraqi Prime Minister soon renamed it Operation Al-Fajr to show that it was indeed an Iraqi-supported mission. The main objectives of the operation were to defeat opposition forces, occupy the city, and clear out both insurgent caches and their supplies. The 1st Marine Division commanded the plan, and a mix of around 15,500 US and UK troops and Iraqi security forces participated in the conflict. Leaflets were airdropped into the city to make civilians aware of the impending attack and to urge them to flee the city. Anyone left behind would be considered an enemy. To help encourage citizens to leave, coalition forces had journalists embedded in their units who reported on the poor treatment of security forces and locals by the insurgents. The campaign soon proved to be effective. Only around 30,000 civilians remained by the beginning of the fight. In preparation for the oncoming onslaught, insurgents began building and planting hundreds of IEDs, dug tunnels beneath buildings to be used as escape routes, and planned caches of supplies that they could access between fighting. As they believed that coalition forces would attack from the south or southeast, they concentrated the majority of their defenses here. Coalition forces prepared meanwhile by examining what had gone wrong during the first Battle of Fallujah and what they could take away from that initial conflict. Eventually, they concluded that they needed to gather intelligence, position their forces, and overall spend a longer time preparing and planning. Which is why it wasn't until November that the battle finally commenced. To help them prepare, they gathered meticulous data on the environment, built up supplies, and carefully examined the best way to attack, including identifying potential sniper positions, roadblocks, weapon caches, and other important information. Throughout October, the participating units learned one another's standard operating procedures, allowing them to be more confident with one another and fully integrated as one unit, rather than operating as several separate units combined. Coalition forces also sought to throw the enemy off their trail by conducting probing attacks on the south and southeast of the city to make them believe that this would be the point of their attack. They also built a fake military base. The operation finally began on the evening of November 7th, when Task Force Wolfpack, which consisted of several US Marine and Army units, stormed into Fallujah from the west of the city. Coalition forces first secured a hospital that intelligence had determined was being used as a command center, and then they captured 2 bridges out of the city, hindering insurgents' movements in and out of Fallujah. The following day, a 12-hour air raid began on the south and southeast of the city to distract insurgents and make them believe that they were being attacked from this direction only. Further units were sent to the Iraqi-Syrian border to close entry points and prevent enemy reinforcements from entering, as well as to stop insurgents from fleeing. As planned, the insurgents' defenses were largely placed in the south and southeast, leaving the north of the city free of many of the traps that had been laid. This allowed coalition forces to avoid defenses as they entered and captured various areas of the city, and they eventually cut electrical power to hinder insurgent operations. Different task forces used slightly differing methods when clearing the north of the city between the 8th and 9th of November. Some believed it was best to clear out every building possible, leading to a slower advance, but it meant that insurgents couldn't hide or escape. Others, though, only checked buildings from which they received fire, meaning that they moved at a much quicker pace and covered more ground. These different approaches, however, served to hamper the efforts of coalition forces. On November 9th, in the northeast of the city, an armored unit named Task Force 22 moved rapidly through the city, while a unit of Marines, who were also in the area, struggled to move as quickly due to a lack of armor. As such, they had to rely on artillery fire and air support, which wasn't always available, considering that it was tending to the needs of other units throughout the city. Before long, insurgents realized that they could avoid Task Force 22 and attack the unarmored Marines when the task force had left the area. This forced Task Force 22 to return to areas that they had previously cleared to help out the exposed Marine units. Although this did slow the overall pace of coalition forces and made the initial battle a little trickier than expected, by the end of the day on November 9th, several units had managed to reach halfway through the city. Over the next few days, coalition forces continued to move south. Despite their best preparations, it wasn't always easy to predict what areas would prove to be more difficult than others. While some parts of the city only offered light resistance, US troops and Iraqi battalions were subjected to heavy fire in others. As a result of this, they began employing a routine of initially ordering an airstrike, followed by artillery or mortars, before finally those on the ground began to move forward. One building at a time would be entered and then cleared out. By this point, fighting on the street had proved too difficult for the insurgents, and they preferred to stay and fight from inside the buildings instead. They often fought in groups of 4 to 12 and used IEDs, RPGs, and other weapons. And while some would fight before making an escape, others stayed and fought until their deaths. At night, troops were able to get some rest, as for unknown reasons, insurgents did not attack when it was dark. The scale of the conflict was huge, and as such, so was the amount of resources used. This is in part because offensive urban operations can use 4 times as much ammunition compared to other campaigns due to the nature of the terrain. It allows for targets to hide and can be easily used for defense purposes. It was later reported that coalition forces fired around 4,000 artillery rounds and around 10,000 mortar rounds during the conflict, while aircraft and gunships dropped around 318 bombs, fired 391 rockets, and dispatched 93,000 machine gun rounds while supporting the troops on the ground. By November 15th, just over a week into the assault, American officials announced that the majority of the city had been recaptured and that coalition forces were left attacking remaining insurgents in the south and southwest of the city. Still, the operation continued until December 23rd, with US and Iraqi units dismantling IEDs and clearing out weapon caches and small areas of insurgents. Following the end of the conflict, coalition forces set to work attempting to rebuild the city, to get emergency services up and running, and to implement electricity and sewage systems. Though the Second Battle of Fallujah was a success, it was not without its criticisms. On November 10, 2004, the Washington Post reported that white phosphorus was being used in the battle, with one journalist who was embedded with Task Force 22 claiming that they'd seen artillery guns firing white phosphorus projectiles. These projectiles, quote, create a screen of fire that cannot be extinguished with water. Insurgents reported being attacked with a substance that melted their skin, a reaction consistent with white phosphorus burns. End quote. The following year, a documentary entitled Fallujah, The Hidden Massacre, backed the claims that the US had used white phosphorus weapons, which impacted both enemy forces and civilians, who were killed or left with chemical burns because of these weapons. News reports from 2004 also noted that corpses had been found either partially burned or melted, while the 2005 documentary showed graphic images of chemical burns so severe that they'd penetrated through to the bones of civilians, including children. Though the US ambassador to the UK, Robert Tuttle, attempted to deny the claims that white phosphorus was used as a weapon during the conflict, US Department of Defense spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Barry Venable told the BBC that the reports were correct, and that such weapons had been used as part of a strategy to draw insurgents from buildings, claiming, quote, when you have enemy forces that are in covered positions that your high explosive artillery rounds are not having an impact on, and you wish to get them out of these positions, one technique is to fire a white phosphorus round into the position, because the combined effects of the fire and the smoke, and in some case the terror brought by the explosion on the ground, will drive them out of the holes so that you can kill them with high explosives. End quote. Several other scandals connected to the conflict soon emerged. In mid-November of 2004, a US Marine drew criticism when a video was shown on NBC News that featured the Marine shooting a wounded insurgent while claiming that the Iraqi individual was playing possum. An investigation was conducted soon after the airing of the footage, but NCIS officials concluded that the Marine had been acting in self-defense. Around this same time, a French news outlet alleged that men and boys between the ages of 15 and 50 were prevented from leaving the city before the conflict began, as they were considered of fighting age. This accounted for the approximately 30,000 civilians who remained in the city after they were warned of the impending conflict. In 2009, there was also some criticism over the fact that US forces had used depleted uranium shells during the battle. These shells are used for armor penetration, but they disperse depleted uranium dust, which is still radioactive, into the environment upon impact. While one newspaper claimed that high infant mortality rates, birth defects, and cancer had become rampant thanks to the use of these shells, a 2012 study claimed that the available evidence did not show a clear increase in birth defects or a clear indication of possible environmental exposure included depleted uranium. It added, quote, there is actually no substantial evidence that genetic defects can arise from parental exposure to depleted uranium in any circumstances. End quote. Another study published that same year concluded that the higher rates of, quote, congenital anomalies are believed to be caused by exposure to some genotoxic agent, possibly uranium. End quote. The conflict is considered the bloodiest and fiercest battle in the Iraq War. It saw the deaths of around 110 coalition force troops, while another 600 were wounded, and between 1,200 and 2,000 insurgents were killed, and a further 1,500 were captured. On top of this, an estimated 800 civilians were killed in the midst of it all, and none of that accounts for the hundreds of soldiers who returned home as different people, and the many troops who took their own lives after facing such nightmarish conditions. One veteran recalled, quote, we have sadly lost more Marines who have taken their own lives than we have lost in combat. Nothing is more heartbreaking than losing someone to suicide after they survived all that they did. End quote. Lance Corporal Chris Lowe was assigned to the 5th Marine Regiment as a bomb technician during the battle, and ultimately left the Marines in 2016. Following the Second Battle of Fallujah, He was diagnosed with PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. Though life has been difficult for him in the years since, he considers himself fortunate to have not been pushed so far to the brink that he ended things himself. He began to look at the good memories he brought home with him, rather than focusing on the horrors that he'd endured, stating, quote, "The time spent there, the blood, sweat and tears, and even laughter, because there were a lot of really good times, good camaraderie. Those memories are going to last forever. The best I can do is live for those who cannot come back."